maybe not everybody was here or doesn't remember what we talked about last Wednesday. Tonight's going to be a sight different, but I did want to recap because it may not make sense otherwise. And I'll recap in kind of an interesting way. I shared that sermon or that Bible study on YouTube just because, and I got some feedback, as the internet will often provide you. But incidentally, one of the YouTube comments does a good job of recapping the point. It was against what I was trying to explain or what I was trying to claim. So I'll quote the fellow. Of course, humans were primate-like before 3200 BC. 3200 was the date I said was when the cuneiform writing was acknowledged as the oldest known writing, I believe. Of course, humans were primate-like before that date. We know that because humans are still primate-like. The reason is, he says, humans are primates. It's cute seeing theists trying to use science like drunks use lamppost for support instead of illumination. And maybe that's what I'm doing or did. But he really nails it. If you wanted to sum up, I may have made some side claims and there were some other lesser points that I was trying to dip my toes into the last time. But the one point is exactly what he says here. He says humans are primates, okay? And of all the suggestions that I was aiming at last time, the big one was that's a misconception and a misrepresentation of what we are. I remember back in middle school science class learning about taxonomy. Our teacher had a unique way of making us memorize it. It worked so well I can't get it out of my mind. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I still got it. That's the taxonomy of living things. Kingdom is the broadest. Or at least it was when I was in middle school. As I understand it now, they've actually, in some scientific schools, gone one higher to something called domain. And there's apparently 3 domains of all living things. A step down would be kingdoms. Some people refer to the domain as like a super kingdom. But the point is you can divide things into different kingdoms and then more narrowly phylum and then classes and all the way down to the narrowest of all, which is species, the most narrow thing. Well, excellent. For scientific purposes, that is very useful. That is incredibly useful. And I have no qualms with that. No qualms with the fact that the animal kingdom, like literally scientifically speaking, the kingdom, one of the broadest classifications of living organisms, Animalia, the animal kingdom, includes you and me. For scientific reasons, that is useful. There are similarities between us and the animals that are useful for scientific discussion. And if that's how scientists find it most effective to categorize, it works well. But and actually, to press that point a little further, we actually make it even further down the chain than kingdom. You and I are in the animal kingdom, so is your dog, and so is the rat that scurries across the floor. We're in the same phylum, class, order, the order of primates, which is what his point was. We are primates. And speaking in terms of scientific divisions, we are primates. And as I understand it, we're in the same family. We don't actually divide from the primates, or we don't actually divide from animals until genus, where there's Pongo, gorilla, pan, and then Homo, like Homo sapiens, which is us. So we get way down the ladder before we finally get some kind of a division from the other animals, if I'm understanding that correctly. For scientific reasons, that's fine. Think about how division works. You can divide things any way that you need to. Dwayne and I were actually, incidentally, just talking about this. Suppose I wanted to divide or categorize all living things by, let's say, height. Well, that would work. I could do that. It would put you and me in the same category as a Bradford pear tree in my yard, as a reindeer. And if you really wanted to press the point, if I wanted to divide all things, all matter, if I wanted to divide it by height, then me and a refrigerator are in the same category. And if that's expedient for what I'm trying to do, maybe I have a low bridge that I'm trying to pass under, and the thing that is expedient for my purposes is I need to know the height. Well, there you go. You can divide things any which way, and that's totally useful for practical reasons. What I contest last time and what I stick to my guns with this time is that for some people explicitly, but I think for all culture, modern culture, at least latently, the fact that we are in the animal kingdom is taken to say that we are of the same stuff as animals. We are of the same kind as animals because science divides it that way. It's like saying, well, if I divide things by height, I'm the same as a refrigerator. In other words, I'm just a refrigerator. I am no better, no worse than a refrigerator. That is the misconception. To say that you are in the animal kingdom, scientifically expedient, not really the case. I think if a theist were to divide the kingdoms, I think there would be an extra one. Or if you want to call it the super kingdoms, the domains, I think there would be those that are made in the image of God would be a separate domain entirely. Now, obviously, that's not going to make it into the secular science books or into scientific thought, and maybe it shouldn't because scientific thought is just interested if can a pig valve work in a human heart, et cetera, et cetera. We want to know practical things, but you and I need to come down to terms on this that you and I are different. We are a sixth-day thing that was made in the image of God, and that puts us, if for scientific reasons we're in the animal kingdom, fine. I have no problem with science. I like people that study things. I like to know when water boils. I like to know how things work, and the observations of how things work is science, and I have no problem with that. No problem with honest science. I do have a mild problem when science tries to dip its toes into philosophy and say that for scientific reasons you're in the animal kingdom, therefore philosophically you are just an animal. It's out of bounds, and it's playing out of bounds. That is a theological arena that you and I are made in the image of God says that we're quite different than the reindeer that we happen to be the same height of, or as the ape, which we happen to have similar appendages to. C.S. Lewis said, just because two things look similar does not necessitate that one is a copy of the other, or that the other is a copy of the one. What if both are a copy of some third thing? And in our belief, we say, yes, that's it, from the mind of God. Every artist, every creator has his signature. Even novelists have this, it's almost like a hidden Easter egg within their works, but it's their flavor. It's just the way that their books sound and things that they hide in there or put in there almost inadvertently. It's the mark of that novelist. You can look at a Fitzgerald novel and a Hemingway novel, and if you do a blind test and you don't know which is which and you've never read either, but if you know the author's style, bam, you know which one is which. God has a signature. And it is impressed upon you and me. It's impressed upon the human, just as it's impressed upon the mighty oak tree and the brilliance of the limbs, just as it's impressed upon the animals. It doesn't surprise me that there's similarities between animals, humans, and other things because they all came in our belief, and I think in actuality, from the same Creator. The personality, the mind of an intelligent God. In the beginning, God. That, by the way, answers the whole conundrum of this morning's sermon, this idea that the living things produce this force. In the beginning, God. He preceded. Genesis starts in a very mysterious way. He was before all of that, before the cosmos, before the creation. Truly, if you want to really get the picture right, you can't even picture God as floating around in infinite dark space because there wasn't even space. In the beginning, God, and that's the mystery of our faith. And from the mind of God, which I do take to be a mind, a rational, language-capable mind. And the fact that we have reason and rationality in language is because we were made in the image of God, and the fact that even the cutest golden retriever doesn't have language or rationality in that sense is because they weren't. No offense. So how do I wrap this into a message that is palatable for tonight? I've divided it into 4 chunks. The first one, if we can go to the next slide, please. You may have been wondering when I read Genesis 1 there, that old story, where's the dirt? Did anybody wonder that? Where's the dirt? Didn't he make man from the dirt? Well, Genesis does a funny thing. It tells the wide lens version in chapter 1, and then it retells it with more of a zoomed-in lens on man in chapter 2. And if you start in chapter 2, verse 4, either on the screen or in your Bible, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. When the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and no shrub of the field had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprung up. The Lord had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no man to work the ground. See, the focus is on man for this second run-through. But the streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the earth, and the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. God formed man from the dust of the ground. Here's my take on the theological, our faith, our doctrine, our beliefs, weddedness to scientific inquiry. Would any of you dare to explain how God did that? I wouldn't dare. And I certainly wouldn't claim that the Bible lays it all out in clear, obvious form. Oh, yes, that's how God made humans. It's not like that. This old story has its eye not on scientific inquiry, not on the nuts and bolts of how he fashioned us into what we are. It has the eye and the lens on the fact that God did it. How we went from dirt to Adam, here it is, I have no idea. And I'm very, very comfortable with that. Very comfortable with that. There's a big debate in Christian thinking and just in human history thinking about, was it 6 literal days or was it 6 ages? And I again, if it's not to offend anyone, I'm very comfortable not knowing. But I will say this peculiarity about the debate that seems to never come up. Is it more or is it less impressive either way? There's somehow in our minds we've got this idea that time, if I just had enough time, it wouldn't be impressive. We almost think of it in the sense, if I said, I walked from Cochran to Hawkinsville, whether or not you're impressed is on how long it took. If I say, I traveled by foot from Cochran to Hawkinsville, it took 5 hours, you're like, well, call me next time, I'll give you a ride. But you're not like, But if I said, I went from Cochran to Hawkinsville in 10 minutes by foot, you are so wowed by the 10-minute thing that you're incredulous and say there's no way. Time is what is often associated with how impressive an act was. That is not the case with everything. Just because that applies on Wes's foot journey from Cochran to Hawkinsville, it does not apply to everything. What if I said to you, I went to the Bleckley County Courthouse, climbed up on the top of the tower, and flew down to the ground? Unaided by parachute or hang glider, I flew down to the ground and landed gently on my feet. In fact, I flew so far because I'm so good at flying that I landed over there at Daylight Donuts and got an original Krispy Kreme, whatever they are. Thank you. Thank you. I say well, it took an hour, and you're like, oh, well. Right? Man raised from the dead, well, I could do that if I had 3 days. Right? Does anyone say it that way? Of course not. A miracle is a miracle is a miracle, irregardless of how long it took. The fact that a man rose from the dead, in an analogous way to if a human really did fly, you're impressed by it whether it took him 1 minute or 10 minutes or an hour. Whether it took him an hour, a day, or 3 days. It's the rising, it's the miracle that is the impressive part. How can we be any less impressed by the 6 age or 6 days of creation one way or another? I am not one whit more impressed either way. It's not like people that read it quite literally and say it was definitely 6 days, which I'm fine with that, have somehow wowed me better than the ones who say that it's 6 epochs. I'm thoroughly wowed either way. Look at the creation around you, and you should be wowed, as Romans tells us. There's another issue here with this business of time that I think is left out, and this is useful to the evolutionary business. How fast does God work? Would anyone dare to answer that question? When God goes from dirt to Adam, what is his rate of speed? And we always talk about him and think about him as if he's some kind of shoemaker. Like, well, the old cobbler down the road, he can put put the shoes together. That other guy, you go to him, it's going to take a while. And he'll resole my boots, but it took him a while. As if God is somehow working at some rate that we could ever comprehend. I have no idea how fast or methodically slow God works. And in science, they teach you about determining the way you determine time. It's all bound up with that question of time. To determine time, you have to know the velocity. You recognize this when you travel somewhere. How long does it take you to get from Cochran to Macon? Someone might say, well, how fast do you drive? Takes me an hour, takes Jay Moore half an hour. Okay. Time and rate are wedded, and they're inseparable. Look at the speedometer on your car. How is it measured? Miles per hour. In order to get the rate, which is your speed, you have to know the hour and how many miles you're going to go in that amount of time. I would contend that since we have no idea how fast God works, no idea, we really, this side of heaven, are not going to have a clear answer to whether it was 6 days or 6 epochs, because 6 days to the God who is creating the very idea of the day. What was the first thing he created? Let there be light. There was morning, there was evening. How much, would anyone dare to say how much God can do in a day? Yeah. So, in the idea of evolution must have taken billions of years, I wonder, the evolution from dirt to man is something like, it's some sort of evolution, and I have no idea how it happened. And if scientists continue to inquire into these things and honestly investigate these things and discover fascinating things, that's fascinating. I will say another little aside before I go to the next point. I'm speaking out of my field here, certainly, but it is interesting that as science continues to discover, it seems to validate more of the original story altogether. I remember Christians, when the Big Bang Theory was beginning to become popular, there was an initial uneasiness with that. Like that, well, we have to. I've listened to Christians teach classes on how that must be wrong for biblical reasons. And however you feel about that's fine. But Louis Giglio, a pastor from Atlanta I really like, did say, yeah, I imagine it was a pretty big bang when the Word of God said, let there be light. The idea that the universe had a beginning, which is now a scientifically tenable idea, that there was a beginning, a big bang, I take great comfort in that and say, well, yeah, I told you that when I read Genesis chapter 1. It had a beginning. And another one, a similar sort of thing, I read a book a few years ago, and I forget the title of it, I'm sorry, but it was about evolution and they were trying to update the theory and make sure it kept up with new discoveries and things like that or whatever. And they were really running into this wall, and you've heard Christian scientists perhaps have talked about this, that some things can't go slowly from one thing to another. The giraffe's neck is an example. The idea being that giraffes with taller necks could reach foliage higher up in the tree and therefore were able to survive. And so they passed on their genes, and thus the giraffe got taller and taller. But there's a lot of problems with that. Like a giraffe, it would have to have happened based on the old original, maybe Darwinian evolution theory. It had to happen slowly, very gradually, over billions of years. And how much advantage is that to a giraffe? Inch by inch. And there was also problems of, it takes a whole different cardiovascular system to pump blood that high up the neck. Did it evolve too at the same rate as the neck? You wouldn't believe what this book, more modern, it's probably, 20 or 30 years old, but it's more modern takes on this thing was that it's this business of the quantum, which I don't know what that means, but it's based off of potentialities that in some sort of alternate universe, this is serious stuff. I'm not joking. Quit laughing. This is this serious idea, this quantum idea that in a potential way, a giraffe evolved to its high neck, and then in a moment of quantum collapse, ka-ching, it became a waking reality on the earth. I was reading that like I have no idea what this guy's talking about, but finally they're at least matching the version to what's in Genesis, that yes, God made, boom, giraffe. In a flash, in what they're calling a moment of quantum collapse. That matches to me. It did have, so they're almost, at least this writer, this scientist, was negating the gradually evolving method, for it gradually evolved in some sort of potential non-reality until it collapsed in the reality of the waking world. And that's something to do with the quantum, whatever that is. And so I only say to say, if science is dealt with honestly and the evidence is, we're not just finding a femur bone and drawing a picture of an ape man. If it's handled honestly, absolutely I love science. I would love to know how God went from dirt to man. I have no idea. But it must be handled honestly. Number 2, rocking right along. The next slide, please, is John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. That's a key tenet of our creed, our faith. In him was life, and that life was the light of mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. One of the criticisms of Christianity is that you accept that. You accept that God was the creator, what they call a priori. You accept that first without any evidence. If you have evidence for something, it's a posteriori, but it's a Christian acceptance by faith. We believe God created it, and then we start thinking and looking at things in terms of that. So that when I see an animal, I think, well, God created everything, and so God created this animal. The animal doesn't prove that to me. I accepted it to begin with. The Richard Dawkins model, or a way of thinking, the evolutionist, secular evolutionism, what we might call it, says that they don't do that. They look only at the evidence. You and I are filling in what we don't know with like the God gap. We just say God did it because we don't know any better. And I just want to encourage you that that's not true. If materialism is the real storyline, this idea that everything became just because it helped something survive. Something survived, and that helped something else survive, and the survival of the fittest, and here we are. If that's true, then one of the most interesting things that it has ever produced is evolutionists. This thought that we're having that things evolved must have been useful for survival. And by those grounds, it can't of its own accord be true. They say that about religion. They say, well, as humans evolved, they developed ideas about God because it helped them survive. It gave them more community, more selflessness, or whatever. Therefore, you're just taking it as the truth, but it was merely just a thought that evolved with the creatures. But we have to remember, if that's the case, then your thoughts about evolutionism also evolved with the creatures. In other words, you may be right, I may be right, but both of us are taking it a priori. The only difference is you're cutting off the branch that you're sitting on. You're saying that nothing can be true. Is that statement true? Everything is a result of survival of the fittest. All your thoughts were just helpful for survival. What about your thoughts? What about your thoughts about how things evolved? Can that also fall under the same acts? And the answer is yes, it can. It's a strange form of circular reasoning. They may be right, we may be right, or there may be some sort of truths in both or whatever, but at least we can accept you have to take it on faith. You have to accept ahead of time the model, and then you can let the model speak to you. The same thing with Christians. We accept that God did it, and from that, looking through those glasses, we can begin to see clearly. That particular critique, I don't think holds water. Sooner or later, a human has to accept a transcendent belief, something that steps out of the feedback loop of what we know, what we say, what we know, what we say. Sooner or later, you have to step out and accept something. This is the way. I believe that comes to us by revelation. I think our faith is grounded quite nicely on the one who made us and has given us that communication. Here's how I did it, or at least here's what I did. I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of how I did it, but here's what I did. In the beginning, there was me. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning God. So that's a quick little round of logic. And then the third one, which I alluded to the last time, but I think it's probably the best point. Whether things evolved gradually or ka-chunged in sort of a giraffe, more flashy, immediate way, whether it took billions of years or 6 days, we all have to admit sooner or later, and Christians thankfully admit, that none of the evolutionary theories explain where it came from. They're never theories of origin. They're just theories of process. A baby going from diapers to pull-ups to regular potty training and on into life, we can watch that process of evolving, let's call it, of growing from one stage to the next. And we could talk about it in great detail. But none of that tells us where the baby came from. I could watch a tree grow from the smallest beginning of the germination to the mighty oak, and I could study that process like an arborist, and it'd be fascinating and great, but none of it would explain where the tree came from. The chicken and the egg question is a fun debate and fun to talk about. But no matter which side of it you're on, neither of it explains where either of them came from. The origin question is the theological concern. Why is there something instead of nothing? In the beginning, God. And there's a next little picture I kind of like. I want y'all to, this is just for educational purposes. Circular reasoning is a type of logical fallacy. Here's another one that I think is useful for you to know about, because this one happens a lot. It's called the Mott and Bailey logical fallacy. It gets its name, it's a metaphorical name from back in the, the medieval days or whatever, back when they used castles for defense. There was a motte, which was very defensible. It's on the high hill there. Nobody's taking the motte. But then there was the bailey, which had thinner walls, and it was where you got into your gardening. It was where you lived, and you could be a little more at ease out there. It wasn't on the high hill, whatever. And so for day-to-day living, you go around in the bailey. But if pressure came from invaders, you retreat to the motte. And I see why this is very useful as a description of a logical fallacy that I think is common. You claim something in your bailey, claim maybe even outlandish things, and as soon as somebody questions you on it, you retreat to your motte and hope they never notice that you changed positions. And so that's a useful one to know. The reason I brought it up for this one is the evolutionism would say, Richard Dawkins does say, we have explained away God. God is a human idea. God is a human construct. He is something you came up with. We have explained it away by evolutionism. And then if you question them and say, well, how does explaining how something grew or how something changed or how something went from one form to another, how does that explain where it came from? And then they retreat to their motte and say, well, what we're really claiming is that things change over time. And then if you back off a little bit, they're back in the bailey. We have explained away God. But what they're really claiming, the only really fundamental thing they're claiming is that animals change over time. I just simply say that's an unrelated question. Whether or not animals change over time or not is unrelated to where they came from in the first place. And I think that's comforting to me. All right, last slide, last point, last bit. Do you and I have to be right about this? Is our salvation contingent on us being right about how God went from dirt to Adam, or how God went from let the seas teem with living creatures and let them produce? Is this something to rip all theology into some great division, and we'll have the church of evolutionism and the church of immediate creation in a blink? In other words, when you get to heaven and you're stopped at the gate, figuratively speaking, is there going to be like an entrance exam, like at the Statue of Liberty when an immigrant wants to come in and you have to prove you know enough about American citizenship to be worthy to enter? And one of the questions on the exam will be, all right, Wes, how'd I go from dirt to Adam? And I say no. I don't think God requires us to be scientists I don't even think that's on his radar. Some are called to this, some are called to that. But we at least know that that's not the top priority. His priority is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so I close with, you know I love a story. I'm going to close with a Bible story to answer this question the best. If we don't have to, if this is not something we have to get right, how did God go from dirt to Adam? Let me show you what we do have to get right. And it's best illustrated in a weird story of reverse evolution in Daniel chapter 4. And it pairs wonderfully with your Sunday school lesson this morning about the flesh versus the spirit. Your animal instinct, your flesh side, which just, what does an animal do? It gets what it craves. You throw a burger out the door where my dog is, it doesn't matter. You know, of course, we have an ill-trained dog anyway, but all she sees is, burger, I want it. And that's the flesh. The sinful nature is that reversion, so to speak, to our more base animal instincts of, I want it, it would make me feel good, I'm going to have it. And the spirit is something higher and more controlled. Well, there was a king, Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm going to start in Daniel chapter 4. We'll just start in verse 24. What came before it, he had some dreams. Had a dream about a tree that got cut down and the stump got rained on. Weird, creepy dreams, nightmares, and Daniel comes to interpret them for the king. Verse 24, this is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree. The Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. It's a story of, in a sense, reverse evolution. He becomes like an animal. If you want to know what you need to get right, it's verse 25. He's going to be like that. An untamed beast of a man until he acknowledges that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men. That's the argument worth having and the heart change worth discussing. And it does happen. If you read the rest of the chapter, verse 28, all of this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and the glory of my majesty? And so he gets a god before the real God, and it's himself. He makes himself the God. Aren't I awesome? This is all by my doing. It's the same thing I was talking about this morning. It's the same thing I was talking about all day tonight. The idea that man created this. We did it. It's Tower of Babel stuff. We can do it. We did it. We created it. The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, God can make a phone call? That had to be a scary one. When a voice came from heaven, suddenly that metaphorical idea, that neat theory actually has thoughts and calls you. You will be driven away from people and you will live like with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people. He ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle. There's another animal. He becomes more like an animal. And his nails like the claws of a bird. There's another animal. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, here it is, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. And I praise the Most High. That's what humans need. Scientific stuff is very interesting. But theologically, that's the citizenship test. We need to look to heaven, acknowledge the Creator, and our sanity, the sanity of our land, will be restored. Let's pray.